Hey guys, welcome back to Rebel Media. Today we're going to be taking a look at another Jayhawker by the name of James H. Lane. No series on the Jayhawking would be complete without talking about him. Last week we talked about Charles Doc Jennison, and this is just another extension of our series of the other side. We talked about Bloody Bill, we talked about Quantrell, and now we're going to talk about one of the most famous Jayhawkers. Here we go. Okay, Mr. James Lane, otherwise known as Bloody Jim or the Grim Chieftain. He was wild-eyed, crazy-haired. He was an opportunist, a senator, a terrorist, and pretty sure he was a little mental. And I'll explain why at the end of the video. So in my last video, I didn't really explain what a Jayhawker was. A Jayhawker is based off a jayhawk, which is a mythical bird, a combination of a hawk and a blue jay. But in Kansas and Missouri, Jayhawkers were anything but a myth. They were free staters and radical abolitionists like John Brown, and they liked to plunder the pro-slavery and even Union residents of Missouri and Kansas. Jim Lane was born in Lawrenceburg, Indiana on June 22, 1814. Not much I could find on his childhood, other than that he was a pretty intelligent guy, and he studied law like his dad and became a lawyer in 1840. He fought in the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848, and after the war he got into politics like his dad also, and he was a governor in Indiana and then a congressman. Lane voted in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed settlers to decide if slavery would be legal within their boundaries. The act overruled the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and this was the beginning of Bleeding Kansas, and the embers of Lincoln's War began to ignite. This was a turning point for Lane because since up until this point he had been a pretty conservative dude. He moved to Kansas, the free soil town of Lawrence, where he was welcomed by the residents, but his wife was not too into it, or him, anymore, and she files for a divorce and goes back to Indiana. In 1855, during the Wakarusa War, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, which was an armed standoff, which started over a pro-slavery dude killing a free state dude, 1,200 border ruffians gathered to attack Lawrence, and Lane fortified the town. Nothing came of it though. Shouldn't even be called a war in my opinion. After John Brown's raid, things really pop off between the Jayhawkers and the Bushwhackers. Jim Lane assumes a new alias and begins doing raids on the border. The feds catch wind of this and issue a warrant for his arrest. Now he has the Missourians and the feds chasing after him. Nothing came of this either, and he actually goes back to Indiana for a bit and mends things with the old lady, and she comes back to Kansas with him. But once they get back to Kansas, he gets into a land dispute with another politician named Jenkins. Jenkins shoots him in the legs, and he blows him away with a shotgun. This lands him in hot water. He is acquitted, but it screws up his career. Kansas joins the Union as a free state in 1861. This is a big deal, and shortly after the first shots are fired in South Carolina in the opening of the war, Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers, and Lane gets a bunch of his dudes, and they actually go to Washington, D.C. When he gets there, the Confederates aren't there, so he basically turns around and goes back, and apparently Lincoln got a kick out of this. Lane releases his men. Some of them go to fight in the western part of the war, and the others go back with him to Kansas. And when he gets back to Kansas, he gives a little speech.
This patriotic army of mine, which you so much fear, shall be to you what the strong-hearted man is to the delicate woman by his side, a shield and support. I will protect you from lawless plunderers and marauders in your own state, from Kansas and from anywhere. But the stern visitation of war will be meted out to the rebels and their allies. Rest assured that the traitor, when caught, will receive a traitor's doom.
Once he gets back to Kansas also, Lincoln actually makes him a brigadier general. And this upsets people on both sides of the aisle because he still holds a seat in the Senate. He then snuck into western Missouri with about 1,500 men, taking secessionist towns by surprise. Him and his men would loot and plunder the civilians' property, and he would also take their slaves. Some wanted to go, and some didn't. And many who didn't want to leave were made to leave by force. One reporter said at the time, "Everywhere that he and his men have been, he carried the knife and torch with him. He's left a track marked with charred ruins and blood." So he's up to no good for a while, and then he reaches the town of Osceola. There's about 3,000 people there, and this is where he really makes his mark in Jayhawker history. Now Lane had heard that the rebels had large amounts of supplies in town, and he wanted to wipe it off the map. After shelling the town, the men looted it, stealing people's valuables and money, and also all the whiskey they could drink. After they loaded their wagons with stolen property, they burned something ridiculous like almost everything but 4 buildings. They took 9 men and shot them dead in the street after a bogus trial that they held by themselves. About 15 to 20 others were also killed or wounded. They caused $1 million in damage, including the property of both pro-Union and pro-Confederate civilians. There are accounts of his men raping women, and it is also said that Jim Lane himself got himself a piano and some dresses for his wife under his own personal plunder. By the end of it, many of the men were so drunk that they couldn't march or ride, and the town laid in ashes. Oh yeah, those Confederate supplies he was looking for didn't exist, and none were ever found. The sacking of Osceola had devastating effects. Not only Quantrell's raid on Lawrence, which he survives by hiding in a cornfield, and that we have discussed on other videos, but now, even people that were pro-Union, they had flipped sides and strengthened their resistance to federal authority. Osceola really blew up in his face. General Henry Halleck said,
"The course pursued by those under Lane and Jennison has turned against us many thousands who were formerly Union men. A few more such raids will make this state unanimously against us."
He gets into a little bit more mischief after this, but after that, it basically ends his brigade. And after Lincoln gets shot, he starts palling up with Andrew Johnson, who's a terrible president. And he actually backs Johnson's veto of a civil rights bill that would have gave constitutional rights to African Americans. And it's kind of a weird take. But he loses favor with the radical Republicans, and things start going downhill for him fast. So Mr. Lane, he was just reelected. Now he's siding with Andrew Johnson. The radical Republicans, they don't like him anymore. And things aren't going well. And then people start to find out, I guess, about some of his shady business dealings, where he's making money on the side, and people are starting to see his true colors. He becomes very despondent, and one of his friends goes to visit him and felt that he was losing it mentally. He said that Jim told him this:
"The pitcher is broken at the fountain. My life is ended. I want you to do my memory justice. I won't ask anything more."
If you remember at the beginning of this video, I told you guys that I didn't feel like he was all there. Well, on July 1st, 1866, he was riding in a carriage with his brother-in-law. And I guess all of a sudden he turned to him and he said, "Goodbye, Mac." And he jumped off the carriage, and before his body hit the ground, he fired a bullet into his skull. The mean old bastard stayed alive in a coma for 10 more days, and then finally gave up the ghost on July 11th, 1866. He is buried in Lawrence at the Oak Hill Cemetery. Well, you might like him, you might hate him, but you can't say he wasn't tough. It's amazing that this dude was a senator during all this, and that the government would allow all these things to happen. And it kind of puts into perspective. It doesn't give an excuse to the violence, but it does help us understand why the other side was so pissed. You know, I think a lot of negativity just goes one way, but there's plenty of bad shit to go around. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I really appreciate you guys being here. I'm very grateful to all of you. I truly am. I appreciate the support. I love the comments, so please leave me some. Tell me what you want to hear, what you want to see, and we'll see you on the next one.